Who sold Assab? History, Law, and the Myth of Ethiopia's Natural Sea Outlet. Framing the question, who exactly sold Assab? This is not a rhetorical flourish. If Assab was supposedly Ethiopia's port, as some Ethiopian officials and propagandists claim today, then we must ask precise questions. Who sold it and to whom? When and under what authority did this transfer allegedly occur? With which government or power did they negotiate? Where is the detailed, legally binding document that proves Assab was ever ceded to or owned by Ethiopia? These are not questions that can be answered by slogans such as, historically Assab is Ethiopian, or geographically it belongs to Ethiopia, or culturally it is part of Ethiopia. Such phrases are rhetorical devices, not legal arguments. They belong to the realm of propaganda, not law. History, even when dressed in incense and liturgy, does not have the power to nullify international legal norms and valid treaties. Vague, sentimental notions of once upon a time cannot form the basis of binding legal title. Those who claim that Assab is naturally or historically Ethiopian must therefore be asked, where is your legal deed? Landlocked Ethiopia is not an Eritrean crime. Ethiopia's status today as a landlocked country without its own coastline is not a grievance that can be laid at Eritrea's door. Eritrea did not snatch a coastline from Ethiopia, nor did it conspire to cut Ethiopia off from the sea. Ethiopia's present condition is the outcome of historical processes shaped by global power politics, particularly the actions of colonial and great powers who drew and redrew borders according to their own interests. It is also a consequence of international legal decisions taken in multilateral forms, especially after the Second World War. These decisions and the international treaties that followed recognized Eritrea as a distinct territorial entity and defined Ethiopia as a state without its own seacoast. Eritrea did not secretly participate in any conspiracy to make Ethiopia landlocked. No such bargain, treaty, or hidden clause exists. To put it plainly, the world did not sit down and say, let us punish Ethiopia by denying it a port. Nor did Eritrea lobby for Ethiopia to be landlocked. Rather, the interplay of colonial conquest, decolonization, and post-war diplomacy produced the map we have today. A map that international law continues to recognize. Haile Selassie, the Great Powers, and the Eritrean question. In the mid-1940s, as the United Nations was being formed and the post-Second World War order was taking shape, the government of Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie actively sought to shape the future of Eritrea. Working closely with Britain and the United States, Haile Selassie pushed for political arrangements that would bring Eritrea under Ethiopian control. This was not a neutral or fair process. It was a diplomatic struggle in which the Eritrean people's own aspirations were sidelined. The result was an unjust outcome. Eritrea was denied full independence and instead forced into a federation with Ethiopia under UN Resolution 390A. This federation was presented as a compromise, but in reality it opened the door to Ethiopia's gradual dismantling of Eritrean autonomy. Today's suffering, displacement, and mistrust between Eritreans and Ethiopians are rooted in that injustice. The burden of historical responsibility lies heavily on Ethiopia, which benefited politically and territorially from arrangements that violated Eritrea's right to genuine self-determination. Law versus propaganda. Given this background, it is striking that contemporary Ethiopian elites increasingly speak in the language of international law, waiving documents and invoking treaties to justify their positions. Behind them stand powerful bureaucracies and well-trained intellectuals who try to dress a fundamentally political and expansionist project in legal clothing. But no amount of legalistic rhetoric can change the core facts. Eritrea's territorial integrity, including its coastline and ports, is recognized under international law. Ethiopia never possessed sovereign title to Assab. Agreements it entered regarding Assab were about use and access, not ownership. For that reason, Eritreans and Friends of Eritrea must continuously peel away the layers of propaganda and return to the historical and legal record. Our task is to ensure that Eritrea's statehood and boundaries are understood not as slogans, but as facts anchored in treaties, resolutions, and long-standing practice. Assab is not for sale. Assab is not and has never been for sale. It is not a spare asset that Eritrea may lease away as if it were selling a warehouse. It is an integral part of Eritrea's sovereign territory. It did not break off from another state and then attach itself to Eritrea. It has been part of the territory that became Eritrea since the period of Italian colonization and beyond. Assab is the principal town of Dankalia, today known as Eritrea's southern Red Sea region. The people of this region are Afar. They are descendants of Afar sultanates whose historic homeland lies largely within what is now Eritrean territory. They are the heirs of patriots such as Muhammad Umar Hakito, one of the early figures in the formation of Eritrean national consciousness. They were among the first to respond in the 1960s when Eritreans took up arms for independence, fighting shoulder to shoulder with other Eritrean communities. Afar Eritreans played leading roles in both the liberation struggle and in the establishment of the post-independence political front. Without Eritrean Afar, Eritrea is incomplete. To amputate Dankalia or Assab from Eritrea is not only a cartographic mutilation, it is an assault on a foundational component of Eritrean identity and struggle. These truths cannot be undone by the Ethiopian government's media campaigns. No slogan from Addis Ababa, no matter how loudly repeated, can erase the fact that Assab's people, history, and institutions are embedded in Eritrea. At its core, Ethiopian propaganda on this issue is an exercise in pressure and distortion. It tries to wear down reality by repetition. It is not a good faith legal argument. Before Italy, empires, ports, and the Red Sea, when Eritrea was on the verge of becoming an Italian colony in the late 19th century, it was one piece in a larger imperial contest. At that time, the Eritrean coast, including Assab, had long been under the influence of the Ottoman Empire and later Egypt. Abyssinian highland rulers in what was then called Medri Habasha, or Abyssinia, did not exercise sovereign control over the Red Sea littoral. Coastal and maritime powers, Ottomans, Egyptians, and later the Italians, made their own arrangements concerning ports and naval access. Crucially, before Italian colonization, there was no modern state called Ethiopia with clearly defined borders and uncontested maritime claims. Instead, there existed a patchwork of kingdoms and chiefdoms, ruled by emperors and regional warlords whose authority waxed and waned. To project today's Ethiopian state back into that fluid landscape and claim a historic right to Assab is to abuse history. Menelik, the colonial moment, and Italy's rule over Eritrea. The rise of modern Ethiopia was closely bound up with the European colonial scramble for Africa. Emperor Menelik II used the rivalries between Britain, Italy, and France to expand his realm and consolidate what would become Ethiopia. This was not the unfolding of an eternal national destiny, but a historical opportunity opened by colonialism. Italy did not occupy Eritrea briefly. It ruled the territory for about 50 years. During this period, Eritrea existed as a distinct colonial entity. Its borders and coastal identity, including Assab, were consolidated within the Italian colonial framework. Ethiopia's primary outlet to the sea for most of this time was Djibouti, not Assab. Before Italy, as power shifted from the Ottomans to Egypt under heavy British influence, Eritrean coastal administration rested in hands ultimately constrained by London. In effect, British strategic considerations, not Ethiopian claims, determined who controlled the coastal gateways. The Hewitt Treaty and British Strategy. The Treaty of Hewitt, signed in 1884 between Britain and Emperor Johannes IV, was a tactical arrangement shaped by Britain's immediate regional concerns rather than any long-term vision for Ethiopian access to the sea. Under this agreement, Johannes received limited rights of use over Massawa, mainly for transit and logistical purposes essential to Britain's military posture. Crucially, these were rights of use, not sovereign rights. Massawa remained under Egyptian authority, which at that time operated within a broader framework of British strategic control. Britain's primary motive for engaging Johannes was not to empower Ethiopia as a maritime power, but to contain the rapidly expanding Mahdist uprising in Sudan. Beginning in 1881, the Mahdist revolt destabilized large areas of Sudan and posed a serious threat to British interests in the Nile Valley. Seeking reliable allies in the region, Britain turned to Johannes, but did so carefully, ensuring that any cooperation did not translate into Ethiopian sovereignty over the Red Sea coastline. The limitations of the Hewitt arrangement became even clearer in early 1885. In February 1885, Italy seized Massawa, with British approval, while Assab had already been under Italian possession since the early 1880s. Britain, recognizing Italy as a fellow European actor whose presence could help contain regional instability, offered no meaningful resistance. Indeed, British behavior amounted to tacit facilitation of Italy's takeover. 5 years later, in 1890, Italy formally proclaimed Eritrea as its colony, embedding both Massawa and Assab firmly within Eritrea's emerging colonial borders. Throughout this entire period, Ethiopia's economic orientation did not rely on Assab. Instead, Djibouti served as Ethiopia's principal maritime outlet, both before and after Italy's establishment of Eritrea. For this reason, claims that Assab was historically Ethiopia's port collapse under scrutiny. Ethiopia's engagement with the Red Sea coastline was limited, conditional, and never rooted in sovereignty. Italy-Ethiopia agreements use, not ownership. During its 50 years of colonial rule in Eritrea, Italy concluded several treaties and agreements with Ethiopia. These arrangements regulated borders, trade, and transit. A key example is the 1928 agreement, which specifically mentioned Assab. Italy granted Ethiopia certain facilities for free transit and warehousing in a designated zone in Assab. Italy undertook to build infrastructure linking Assab and nearby areas with the Ethiopian hinterland. Crucially, this agreement dealt with commercial use, not political sovereignty. Assab remained Italian Eritrean territory. Ethiopia was a user of the port, no more than that. Even after this agreement, Djibouti continued to function as Ethiopia's main maritime gateway. Assab did not replace Djibouti as Ethiopia's principal port, nor did Ethiopia acquire sovereign rights over Assab. British military administration Assab as Eritrean territory. In 1941, a coalition of British-led Allied forces advanced from Sudan and decisively dismantled the fascist administration in Eritrea, effectively terminating Italy's colonial presence in the territory. Britain then established a military administration over Eritrea, including Assab. Under this administration, Assab remained legally and administratively part of Eritrea. British officers, together with Eritrean officials, managed customs, tariffs, and port operations. Dankalia was recognized as one of Eritrea's provinces. Its connection to Eritrea was not questioned. British regulations explicitly clarified the status of Assab. Among their provisions were: Assab is not Ethiopian territory. Ethiopia has no sovereign rights over Assab under any existing treaty. All customs and tariffs in Assab are collected and administered by the British in Eritrea. Ethiopian nationals cannot be employed as port workers in Assab. In other words, British policy reaffirmed that Assab was part of Eritrea, not Ethiopia. Any Ethiopian use of Eritrean ports continued to fall under arrangements of transit and access, not territorial ownership. The UN Federation and its destruction, post-war debates about Eritrea's future culminated in UN General Assembly Resolution 390A-V in 1950. This resolution imposed a federal arrangement linking Eritrea to Ethiopia. Under the federation, Eritrea was to retain its own flag, government, and internal autonomy. Assab, as part of Eritrea, remained Eritrean territory, administered by Eritrea's own institutions. Ethiopia was recognized as the federal partner, not as a colonial ruler. However, from the mid-1950s onward, Ethiopia systematically violated the federal constitution. Eritrean institutions were hollowed out or abolished. The Eritrean flag was lowered. Political parties and the press were suppressed. Finally, in 1962, Haile Selassie unilaterally dissolved the federation and declared Eritrea the 14th province of Ethiopia. This act had no legal foundation in the federal constitution and no democratic mandate from the Eritrean people. It was an annexation comparable in spirit, if not in every detail, to Russia's later annexation of Crimea. Even then, international law did not magically transform Eritrean territory into Ethiopian soil. What existed was an occupation imposed by force, met by Eritrean resistance and decades of armed struggle. Throughout this period, Assab remained, in truth and in law, Eritrean territory under Ethiopian control, not Ethiopian land. If you return, we return. Today, when Ethiopian officials and propagandists again insist that Assab is Ethiopian, or that Eritrea must give us access, they are not reviving some forgotten legal instrument. They are reviving a political project that has been rejected by history, by law, and by the Eritrean people's sacrifices. To this, the appropriate response is the following phrase: Fa'in rotum rodna, if you return to your old ways, we will return to our response. If they return to recycled claims and myths, we will return to the full historical and legal record. We will remind them Eritrea is a sovereign state with recognized borders. Assab is part of Eritrea's internationally recognized territory. Ethiopia has never possessed lawful title to Assab, only transit arrangements at various points in history. We are still here. The facts are still here. Assab is Eritrea.
ታሪክ ሃገር ሓበን ዝኾኑ ክሳብ ዝግለጽ በብእዋኑ